First and foremost, I want to thank you, my mom and dad, for your continual love and support. Thank you so much, Grandpa Ryan, for consistently being such an awesome tutor. Thank you to my mentor and uncle, Brian Kennedy, for helping me during this long thesis process. And finally, thank you all for coming here and supporting me. Without further ado, let's begin. Nobody is free until everybody is free. Fanny Hammer believed that unless a country promotes the freedom of everyone, no one will truly live freely, but instead remain in slavery. Slavery is a challenging topic, which most individuals are aware of, especially with the racist chaos that has exploded across the country this past year. If someone were to ask what slavery is, you might respond by answering that it was a time in history when thousands of Black people were stolen from their home country and forced to live as slaves. However, that answer is only an example of slavery. The complete answer consists of more than just the slavery of Blacks. For centuries, slavery has corrupted countries across the world, including America. To this day, our country continues to pay the consequences for permitting slavery. If we look back in history, it's clear that when a country legalizes slavery, it produces negative results. Slavery of Blacks played a significant role in the Civil War in America. Thousands of Jews' lives were destroyed, resulting from a type of slavery during World War II. Currently, thousands of men and women are held hostage in a modern form of slavery to benefit the economic state of others. Enslavement impacts the world we live in now. Today, our society is an example of the consequences of slavery that has been permitted in our country. The term consequence is used frequently throughout my thesis. Result is similar to consequence, except in this thesis, the term consequence will refer to a negative result. Throughout my thesis, I compared slavery in the 1800s to present-day slavery by looking at the personal consequences that each produced. By personal consequences, I mean the number of lives that are affected. For clarification purposes, I define three key terms. 1, slavery is the state of a person who is chattel of another. 2, slavery in the 1800s is considered the enslavement of Black people. And finally, 3, present-day slavery is human trafficking and coercion. In 1788, the Constitution declared that any individual not free would be counted as 3/5 of a free person. The Constitution did not blatantly specify Black people as only 3/5 of a free person. However, whites freely treated Blacks as property, or less, and Blacks lived in submission. The U.S. government assumed the right to dictate who possessed the right to freedom and who did not. The color of skin determined whether an individual owned the valuable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Society's willingness to belittle others played a role in the eruption of slavery in America. In many situations, the ownership of Blacks became a cruel and hateful practice. Leon Litwack, a former slave, stated, quote, "It's too bad belonging to folks that own you body and soul, that can tie you up to a tree with your face to the tree and your arms fastened tight around it, who take a long curling whip and cut the blood every lick. Folks a mile away could hear those awful whippings. They were a terrible part of living," end quote. Blacks were put under inhumane circumstances. Even the most benign slavery was always immoral and oppressive. Slavery in the 1800s produced numerous personal consequences that affected thousands of Black lives. First, a significant amount of Blacks lived in slavery. In the 1800s, 800,000 Black men, women, and children suffered because of slavery. Second, as a result of slavery, Blacks were often viewed as inferior or even second-class citizens. This promoted the physical abuse Blacks received from their slave owners. Third, slavery in the 1800s continues to affect us today. As stated previously, racist chaos has exploded in America over the last year, primarily because many individuals claim the racism in the 1800s continues to exist today. Fourth, and finally, the Civil War is an important personal consequence of slavery in the 1800s. Slavery forced America to fight itself in order to finally conclude that every human, no matter the color, inherited at birth the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Today, it's apparent Americans quickly forgot the importance of upholding freedom and value in life. Slavery is prevalent today. Slavery today involves all races. Men, women, and children are forced to spend their lives submitting to the command of the slaveholder. Martin Luther King Jr. believed, quote, "Slavery in America was perpetuated not merely by human badness, but also by human blindness. Men convinced themselves that a system that was so economically profitable must be morally justifiable," end quote. This idea is the primary cause slavery existed in the 1800s and continues to exist today. Today, slavery hides entirely in the shadows. Thousands of people are illegally trafficked daily, and a significant percentage of it goes under the radar. Increase in violence and abuse is one out of many consequences of slavery today. Because slavery is illegal, slaveholders are constantly covering their tracks, hoping to remain in secret. Fear of being exposed results in present-day slavery endangering every individual that is involved. Modern enslavement comes in different forms. However, human trafficking is the most common form of slavery today. It involves all forms of exploitation, such as domestic servitude, child labor, bonded labor, and forced sex. In many cases, human trafficking survivors stated that they have been forced to participate in isolated, web-based sexual activity or pornography. Sex trafficking victims express that the marketplace for such activities continues to grow. Web-based sexual activity is almost worse than in-person slavery. Individuals, typically women, are pulled into a system online that purposely conceals the identity of the slave owner. Threats and coercion from the slave owner online forces the victim to perform sexual activities that is then sold to others. Slaves do not benefit in any way. Instead, the slave owner continues to control and coerce the victim for financial gain. Sextortion begins when a predator reaches out to a young person over a game, app, or social media account. Through deception, manipulation, money, gifts, and threats, the predator convinces the young person to produce an explicit video or image. When the young person starts to resist requests to make more images, the criminal will use these threats of harms or exposure of the early images to pressure the child to continue producing content. Sextortion is occurring all over the US. The most terrifying aspect about web-based slavery is the difficulty in tracking down the predator. Children continue to fall into threatening and coercive situations because they fail to be on guard in response to strangers. The number of slaves in America continues to increase. The U.S. Department of State estimates that 14,500 to 17,500 people are trafficked into the United States each year. That statistic does not include the number of slaves already in America. The Washington Post declared 60,000 individuals were already enslaved in 2013. If we add the number of slaves already in America to the number of slaves brought to America each year, it sums to roughly 75,000 individuals enslaved in the U.S. in just 2013. It is challenging to decide whether past or present slavery produced worse personal consequences. On one hand, slavery in the 1800s was a very public institution. Whites held up fellow human beings to be inspected like animals. Whites sold different family members to different slave owners for the highest bid. Such slavery legitimatized the physical abuse of men, women, and children. The permanence of slavery in the 1800s affects us today. Because racism reigned freely in the past, our country has exploded with rage that racism may still exist today. On the other hand, present slavery dwells in the shadows, not on the auction block like yesteryears. It survives by stealing individuals away and forcing them to spend the remainder of their lives in servitude. Today, slavery comes in numerous forms. It does not just focus on one type of people. It encompasses every race and every age. Slavery today traps individuals into a variety of different types of slavery. This results in a higher number of people enslaved. Roughly 75,000 individuals suffered from slavery in 2013. This statistic is not including the large portion of strategically victimized children on web-based slavery. Previously, I defined personal consequences as lives affected. With this in mind, the roughly 800,000 enslaved people in our past left an enormous wake of splintered families, crushed dreams, violated bodies, and hurts that ripple to our society today. It is true that modern-day slavery has similar devastating effects on lives, but the reality is it does not affect as many people, and as society, we do not embrace it. If we, as a society, are not vigilant, we could see the shadowy slavery of today grow and eventually encompass more lives. It is because of the legalized slavery of 800,000 Blacks in comparison to 75,000 enslaved individuals today that I decided slavery in the 1800s produced worse personal consequences than present-day slavery.
All right, Holly, good to see you in this position. When you initially asked me if I would take part in this, slavery, that is a huge topic. And what occurred to me is that there was one specific event or circumstance that triggered you to select this very broad topic.
Are you asking if there was a certain, okay. Last year in Challenge 3 as a junior, we read this like 888-page history book, and it was gigantic and covered topics from the 1600s to present day. And slavery was a really big topic that was covered in that book, and I really enjoyed learning about it, especially as a class. We got into really good discussions, And so last year I actually decided I really want to do a thesis on slavery. Not just slavery, but something about it. And I had told numerous of my friends I want to do a thesis topic on slavery. And so this year when I was writing it, I was like, and my sister went to Guatemala and there was sex trafficking, and I thought it'd be interesting to compare sex trafficking today to slavery in the past, and not just sex trafficking, just any form of human trafficking and slavery today. And also the fact that near my house there was a club that opened up called The Platform, and it's pretty much a strip club. And when I was 14, I wrote a letter to the governor and I asked them to close it down. And in Kearney and in Great Island, they had actually successfully closed that business down, but for some reason, Hastings couldn't shut it down. And I looked at it and I was like, the location of that strip club is so convenient. It's on Highway 6. It's also close to a motel, and easily people could get trafficked. And also, Hastings has a really high number of people that are trafficked. And so I was like, it would be really interesting to compare those two topics. So.
Thank you.
Holly, I want to ask you along similar lines about your definition of slavery. You started off your thesis with, I think the quote was, slavery is the state of a person who is a chattel of another. And you are comparing slavery in the past, in our history as a nation, with these other forms of slavery that you label as trafficking and forced labor and coercion. How did you get to the point of kind of equating those things to a definition of slavery, and what other things did you consider, and how did you kind of get to that rationale?
Well, slavery, as my grandfather said, is such a huge topic, and I knew that I needed to narrow it down significantly, maybe not enough. And I decided that slavery in the 1800s would remain primarily focused on just slavery of Black people, just to keep that focus on that. And then present-day slavery, because there's so many different types, in my abstract I didn't actually state all of them, but there are so many different types of slavery in America that talking about every single one of them would just take an extensive amount of time. And so I realized I needed to focus on the more significant and more life-effective slaveries, like how many lives are involved. And so just human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, coercion, that's what I decided to narrow down on.
My next question moves on a little further. Actually, it moves quite a long ways back. In the early days of our country, with a lot of slaves present, it was a challenge how you're going to count these. And probably in your reading, you came across this that our forebears in our government decided to count the slaves as 3/5 of a person. They were operating between a couple of different standards. And do you recall what those were? The voting on the one side, which would have inflated the number of potential voters, and the tax burden on the other side. That always amazed me, that 3/5 of a person. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I did read a lot about the 3/5. And what I specifically read about was how there was a lot of division between the North and South, even back then, and how the government needed to appease both sides. And so in order to do that, they need the 3/5 in the Constitution. However, it's clear that when they did that, there was still division between the North and the South. And I thought that was interesting. I was like, they see that there's division, and even the 3/5 thing didn't fully appease them, because there was a civil war that was partly took place because the North and South were still really infuriated with each other, which led back to previously the Constitution trying to appease both sides. So yeah, I did find that very interesting as well.
Holly, I've been pretty close to this project and watching you develop it and watch you work through it. I remember the first conversation we had about it, the latest conversation that we had about it. And I just want to say that you chose a very ambitious topic and that you navigated it extremely well. When we initially talked about it, I thought, you know what, there's a real good chance that Holly's going to bail on this and move to something else before this ends. But you stuck with it, you navigated it, you created a thesis that I thought had power and impact. It changed several things that I think personally, that of how I think about slavery. And so I just want to compliment you and thank you for working that through all the way to the end. You did, with the modern day slavery, which I found extremely interesting. It opened my eyes to the idea of it. You spent quite a bit of time talking about the forced sex aspect of it, the sex trafficking, which I think was a powerful topic and was appropriate. But you also mentioned a couple other types of human trafficking. The first being domestic servitude, child labor, and bonded labor. And I would just like to hear a little bit more of what that kind of description of what those were or are, and how they affect us today.
Bonded labor and can you list the second one?
Child labor and bonded labor.
So child labor and bonded labor are very similar to human trafficking. It's kind of like a branch off of them. It's pretty much capturing individuals and forcing them into an institution that typically lasts their entire life. And they have no benefits from it, except they are the slaves and they have to do whatever the slaveholder tells them to do. That's pretty much what they are. Except they're definitely different than like sex slavery.
Is it as common as sex trafficking?
No, sex trafficking is a lot more common than child labor and bonded labor.
I'll stick with this kind of theme of the modern day slavery definition. When you compare these two types of slavery, these two periods, the historical slavery is predominantly race focused, right? Based on your research, is race involved now when you talk about these more common or more modern forms of oppression? Or are there other sort of factors that contribute to the types of people that tend to be exploited?
From what I researched, it wasn't really race. Like in the 1800s, like you said, Black people, that's who were the victims. Nowadays, the largest group of people that are victimized are primarily women for sex trafficking. So many, you hear about sex trafficking all over America because it's one of the largest sex or slavery institutions that are illegal in America. And so because of that, it's primarily women that get hooked into it and taken control of.
This question goes back to pre-World War II, about that time. I don't know if in your reading you came across the fact that the Germans, the Axis powers, Germany, Hitler, studied how the United States was dealing with its black problem, with its Negro problem, and gave the Axis the idea of how to deal with their Jewish problem. And that was amazing when I initially heard that they were patterning that persecution after something they saw in our country. Did you come across any of that in your reading?
The first time I heard about that was actually from you. I went over and talked to you and visited you, and we had this whole conversation on slavery and how Hitler mirrored his dealing with the Jews by looking at America. I never actually saw that in any of my reading, primarily because I focused on slavery in America and slavery today versus then. But you gave me that book and I definitely want to read it because it's really interesting.
One of the things that you talked about was that devaluing a person is central to slavery. And so I wanted to ask, do you think that slave owners devalue life as a result of slavery? Or do you feel that slavery is a result of people devaluing other people's lives? Because you had talked a little bit about abortion in some of your initial drafts, and so do we devalue life that creates slavery, or does slavery create us devaluing life?
I honestly think it's a lot of we devaluing life and then creating slavery. However, I think it might be a little bit of the other as well. Because if you have such enough drive for money or whatever you need, and then you're willing, you enslave people, then I think there's a process of after you enslave someone, then you're more willing to just devalue their life and count it as unimportant or valueless. However, I think most slavery begins by people being willing to devalue life and others, and then creating slavery, because that's a huge step. If you devalue life, then you can do anything you want with another person.
You had connected abortion as a type of slavery, which was kind of shocking to me. I hadn't thought of it in those kind of terms because there's not work created or done or forced on the fetus. But it delved into that just a little bit, what you saw as the connection between abortion and slavery.
In my first draft when I was writing this, I came across a piece of evidence, and this guy said that abortion and slavery have very similar thought processes. People see abortion as totally justifiable. Women that are anti-life and pro-abortion, they devalue the life. They say, I don't need this because of these reasons. So then they tell themselves, okay, it's a fetus, it's tissue, there's numerous other kind of shocking names that people use to refer to a baby inside of a womb. And in order to justify murdering a baby, they defined it by those names and considering it not human. And so similarly to slavery in the 1800s, that's what I was comparing it to, and even slavery today. In the 1800s, slaves were not called, hey, that human over there, that person with, they were probably called their names. More often than not, they were called explicit words and treated such as they were not human, as if they were not human. So I just saw a big similarity between that, because those people that are devalued and named something else, they're the ones that are being treated less than human, and that's the same with the baby inside of the womb to Black people in the 1800s and women and men and children today.
Yeah, that's really thought-provoking. That's a good answer, Holly. Along those same lines, you just used the word justify a couple of times in that answer, and you write about in your thesis this idea of society permitting slavery and permitting these things to happen. You also just read in your abstract an amazing quote from Martin Luther King. I'll read it for everyone again. He said, "Slavery in America was perpetuated not merely by human badness, but also by human blindness." And he goes on to talk about society convincing themselves that slavery was morally justified. Can you expound as you think about both the historical definition of slavery and current, what are some of the factors in society that permit this? What are those forms of blindness that contribute to allowing something like slavery or other forms of oppression, including even going all the way to abortion, to persist?
So first I'm going to talk about slavery in the 1800s. Part of the reason why there was a division between North and South was because the South was benefiting a lot economically from having slaves, and the North was not as much. And so the North people, they were quicker to see these are humans, and the South were like, no, they're not. They're benefiting my economic state, my financial gain. They're not humans. So that's why it was justifiable, because in their minds they thought, these people are benefiting me, they're allowing me to earn more money. They're not human. They're not human. They're a means to get more money and profit more. And then, so that's why it's justifiable for them. And then today, I haven't thought about it. Okay, can you repeat the question one more time?
Well, one of the things he talks about is blindness. So a second part of my question, maybe just to take you there, is what are the ways that society might be blind today that causes or leads to a justification of oppression?
So this is actually something that I wrote in my first draft as well, but I ended up deleting because it caused issues. There's a lot of objectification allowed in America, and what I mean by that is strip clubs, magazines that have images of women barely dressed, and there's movies, books made off of to promote sensual content. And so people that are seeing this on the receiving end, they quickly just objectify people. And so this kind of promotes this, oh, that's just like, they see people not for the quality that they are, but for what, like the image that they are, if that makes sense. So it promotes, and this really falls into sex trafficking. It promotes that a lot more because women are so objectified nowadays. So that's what I think would kind of encourage that.
Since we're meeting in a church today, this question is kind of long ago. Many references regard slaves that seem to be acceptable in both the Old and New Testament. I was wondering, as you evaluated, what you worked on, and then with your background in the Bible, studying different parts of the Bible, how do you would you describe the Bible's seeming acceptance of a degree of slavery and applying it to today's problem with slavery?
So you're asking me how I can see how the Bible handles slavery?
Yeah. Is there a prohibition against slavery anywhere explicitly?
I think, so in the 1800s, there were like indentured servants. And that was something that wasn't necessarily horrible because those people were typically treated, those black people were typically treated pretty well, and they were able to actually make a living. They were paid. And then they were still considered slaves, which isn't the good part of it, but they were treated a lot better than like people, men on a plantation. So I think that like the Bible, I think when it talks about slavery, it speaks in the times a while ago when slavery was like normal, and it was normal, like for example, concubines. That was probably a form of slavery back then, but it wasn't necessarily bad because so many rich kings had concubines, and they weren't like treated as complete dirt. Sometimes, I'm sure sometimes they were as well. So I think that's like the time, that's the time period that the Bible's referring to. Nowadays, I don't think the Bible really speaks on slavery really relating to today.
That was a tough one. That was well navigated there. So, but and so I kind of have a follow on with that. That isn't any easier. Sorry. So slavery is an aspect of degrading life and of lust for riches because it has an economic base to it, and then it affects a moral interpretation of it. So, and we've seen it for centuries, not only in what I would consider modern day, but also for, millennia back with slavery. So, do you think that we as mankind have the ability to ever leave slavery behind us, or is it something that will most likely affect us for our entire future? That's an opinion. You don't have to back it up. I'm just asking your opinion.
I'm just thinking about how I'm going to say this. I think that we're all created with a sinful nature. We all have that desire to please, number one, ourselves. And we all want to do whatever we can to put ourselves first. Even if we're Christian, we still have that desire to, give ourselves the best every time. And so no matter where we go, I think that we will always battle that, everyone in society. I think slavery is a far branch off of selfishness. And so if you're just trying to live in this world for yourself and you don't really care about anything, then that's easy to fall into. And so I think unless the entire world was Christians, which is not the case, slavery probably, I don't know, slavery wouldn't exist, but like you said, that's a tough question.
No,
So
I
my
think
answer is no.
Yeah.
I don't think we could ever really leave that.
behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Holly, I want to talk about or ask you about your conclusion to this paper or this thesis, because you focus on consequences and then you're trying to make an assessment of which era has greater consequences. And it's interesting, you used a quote where you talked about slavery as a theft of a life, a theft of work, a theft of property, a theft even of future offspring. And that made me think about the fact that the end of historical slavery led to things like we see today, where we've had an African-American president of the United States and an African-American vice president now of the United States, things that would not have happened if slavery didn't cease. But you also talk about the ripple effects of historical slavery and the fact that that still exists and affects us today. And that's part of what led you to this conclusion that earlier slavery was a greater consequence than modern day. But if you were to project into the future, just like there are ripple effects today of historical American slavery, have you thought or could you consider the kind of ripple effects that might be in the future for the sorts of oppression that you highlight? Like what are those sorts of things as you look in the future that are going to affect our society or affect individuals that are a consequence of modern day slavery?
So
Sorry, not an easy question.
We're past the easy ones.
in my first draft, I talked a little bit about how truth has been so subjective. And I deleted that because it also caused some issues. But I'll talk about that a little bit. Because modern day slavery exists, I think it's partly because truth has been changed. That's just my own personal opinion. And so I could see that later down in the future, because modern day slavery exists today, truth becoming even worse. There is no truth at all. Even children are pulled into strip clubs. So just imagine everything that we have now accelerated if it doesn't end. Just because the morals nowadays are so different. There isn't one set thing that you can land people with agreeing.
You know, and on that line, you point out in your thesis that it took Civil War to end historical slavery. What sort of tools or forces do we have as a society today to end modern day slavery?
I think it's that we need to go back to the definition of what truth is. That's what I think would change modern day slavery. Maybe not end it entirely, because as I said previously, I don't think slavery is ever gonna not exist, just because we're all flawed human beings. But I think in order for the wicked slavery that exists today to end, people need the Constitution, not the Constitution, the government needs to live by the truths that the Constitution that promotes, and push for that in America, and also make sex trafficking and any other modern form of slavery such a big deal that everyone in society that isn't a part of it that anyone that might see it, try to put it to an end, because it goes against every truth that's in the Constitution.
Those have been tough questions. This pertains to a latter part of your thesis, and I'll quote the particular statement: "Racist chaos exploded in America during the past year." And are you relating that to the police brutality or other actions that occurred within the public sphere?
I'm speaking specifically, or referring specifically on the George Floyd incident. After that occurred, a lot of racism has kind of exploded all across America. The Black Lives Movement has soared, and everyone is like, oh my goodness, racism is still existing today, just because a black man was killed by the policeman.
One of the things that I noticed as I was reading through your thesis, and I said this earlier, that it had kind of changed my thought process. And one of the sections, specifically with is, if I can say it right, the sextortion that you talked about, and you gave a kind of described that in your abstract. Because as a parent, I've always tried to protect my kids from online predators, that type of idea, but I never really drew a conclusion of what that actually meant, and that my kid down in the basement could end up being in contact with a predator that ends up enslaving them to not just a moral issue or taking their innocence away, but actually enslaving them, and that was startling to me. But my question is specifically, what did you, in your research or in your writing, is going to stick with you as you go forward in the years to come? That a statistic, a thought, an aspect of your thesis that you're going to carry with you.
A lot of it was really interesting to me, and everything that I wrote on, I was like, this means something to me. But I would say primarily how truth is subjective and how that's really sad. Just generally, this is really sad across America, how so many people believe different things. And then also how to just treat everyone fairly, that's important as well. Whites, blacks, doesn't matter who the person is, what they have wrong with them, or what you think is different. They're just as equal as you are. And that obviously comes back from a Christian belief of everyone is fearfully and wonderfully created. But just to live by that, because I set an example for those around me, and other people in society see how I interact with other people. So just to live by that and set an example of everyone is equal and everyone has equal rights and values. And then also the moral slavery of sextortion, that was really interesting to me as well. And it gave me more on guard to my social media that I have, or where I go in the future. If at college, I'm sure there's going to be creepy people. Just to have that on guard, because morals today are so wacko, just have that on guard towards people. That's what I would say has stuck with me.
Okay, so I want to go back to your conclusion again a little bit, because as you were working your way through this process, you sort of moved back and forth in terms of where you were going to net out. And I thought maybe it'd be helpful just to hear that thought process and expound on why you ultimately concluded what you concluded. It seems to me, and you point this out, it's very difficult to ever compare different forms of evil and try to, ascertain a degree of, evilness, if you will. It's almost an unfair question, but that is the question that you posed. So maybe can you just spend a minute on how you got to where you got and why you concluded what you concluded?
Between my thesis draft, thesis revision, and final product, I switched my conclusion each time. I was really pulled apart because modern slavery, because society doesn't necessarily embrace it and promote it, make it legalized, it lives and dwells completely in secret. And that is really terrifying because you don't know who all is involved in that. And that's part of the reason why I was so like, oh, this is so much worse, because society doesn't embrace it. And you just never know where it's existing. For example, even your child could be involved and you don't know unless they tell you. So it's just terrifying to me. And that's partly why I concluded at first that present-day slavery is worse. And also I had my statistics wrong. That's another reason why. But then I went over and I realized not only were the numbers wrong, but I also narrowed my approach to concluding to just the lives affected. And because I narrowed it to that specifically, I had to conclude that the 800,000 to
75,000, and that's just in 1 year actually, it's 75,000. It's just the 800,000 way outnumerates that. And part of the big reason why I concluded that slavery in the 1800s produced worse personal consequences was also how it's still affecting today. That should not be happening. The fact that it ended so long ago, yet it's still prevalent today. People are infuriated by it because of the racism that occurred. So that was how I made my final conclusion.
This is in terms of more give and take. In a recent book that I read, the author indicated and compared the untouchables in India with the black situation, the Negro situation in America. And I never had really had, mentally compared that. And I realized probably in your research, you may not have come across that comparison. But the author in that book pointed out that it seems like every society subjugates or you want to put different statuses where you can say, well, I'm better than they are. And that occurred back in the early times where the blacks were the bottom measure, and even the poor whites, as I think I mentioned to you one time when I was in the military in Georgia, South Georgia, it was still better to be a poor white trash than a black. You probably didn't come across any reference in your reading, or did you, on that?
I didn't come across any reference to the untouchables and the blacks in the 1800s. However, I definitely agree with how every society has their little label they put on different they put status on different people. And the black people, and even as you mentioned earlier, World War II, they lived with it on the Jews. They were people that just needed to get killed and taken away because they weren't humans, he concluded, or whatever. So yeah, I definitely agree with that.
You probably had as difficult to process in writing a thesis, and one, the topic, narrowing it down, trying to find a measuring stick with it, but then also there were several curves that happened in your editing process. Like you said, there were huge sections that you deleted, that you replaced, that it was a monumentous effort to try to get that to get all the way through. So looking back at it, what did you learn in the physical process of creating and writing and delivering a thesis that you want to, what did you learn from it? What would you do different? What would you do the same?
What I would do different is probably try to narrow my topic down a little more. A lot more, probably. It just caused so many issues for me. I would easily run into numerous little rabbit trails here and there, because this topic has so many little parts to it I came across. And so it just caused so many issues for me, and I also ended up repeating myself so many times throughout the 20 pages. And I looked at my draft and I was like, this is horrifying. I need to change this big time. So from the beginning of my thesis process, when I picked my top topic, I needed to ask others to see if there's a simpler or a more narrowed down approach that I could take, and not just get so focused on just what I was hoping to do, because even though slavery is super interesting, it's just a really difficult topic to write 20 pages on. And then, what I would do different, and then what was the other ones?
Or something that you would do the same, or just what did you learn in the process?
Also, what I would do the same, I thought that I did a pretty good job working over from beginning. I had a tiny bit of procrastination just for like a week, and then I started working. And once I started working, I stayed on it pretty steadily. I thought that was good because it allowed me to work over the past semester extensively. So I thought that my workflow was pretty good, except just because it was such a big topic, I had to rework a lot last minute. But yeah, that's what I would probably do the same, is because thesis is such a big project, doing it over a long period is really important and helpful.
Well, Holly, I wanted to say that I applaud your ambition for going after something so big and difficult. And I think you said somewhere in your thesis that no one should take lightly the topic of slavery, and I don't think you took it lightly. I think you took it on seriously, and it speaks to sort of your broader ambition that you try to do something so big. I am really proud of the way that you forced yourself to gradually narrow that down and hone in on something and tackle something really interesting, which is compare two completely different things in most people's mind and draw the correlation between them in terms of the effect and the impact that it has on people's lives. And I thought you did that well and drew it out. And great job.
Yeah.
Great
Thank
job.
you.
Just wanted you to know that I've run out of questions.
Answer them all.
And you just have done a wonderful job. And one thing you did was drive myself anyway, I don't know about Brian, but go back and review some historical data. You did a wonderful job. Thank you so much.
Thanks, James.
I actually have like 12 more, no, I'm just kidding. You have done a wonderful job, not only in the creation of your thesis, but also in a response to the panel. This has been a phenomenal conversation. You are an incredible young lady, and like I had said earlier, it has been a privilege to be a part of your homeschooling adventure with you and your family. Thank you so much for what you've done. Let's please give Holly a hand.